Good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk about positivity, as Jules has just mentioned. There's an awful lot that's written about positivity and optimism, and much of it really focuses on it being part of one's DNA. So you've either got it or you haven't. I would view myself as a realist, so to an optimist, probably a bit of a pessimist, but actually the way in which I deal with life or deal with issues and what I'm trying to achieve is to make sure that I have a very clear understanding of what the ultimate goal is. I then look at the major things that might have an impact on me achieving that goal, whether it's positive things or negative things, and then start looking at some basic building blocks to help me achieve my ultimate aim. And I keep them as quite small, targeted and measurable steps that I'm trying to achieve. And that does two things, really. First of all, it allows me to get some success quite early on and breed a bit of optimism. Secondly, if something goes horribly wrong, it doesn't blow up the whole plan. And actually, you can then readjust. It enables you to be quite flexible. And these are the sorts of things that I was thinking about when I had a pretty extraordinary year, as Jules mentioned, setting up DHL in Iraq. Now, there's a military adage that says that no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and actually that couldn't have been truer for my 12 months out there. So whilst these two clowns were planning their preparations for war, I was going for interviews in Bahrain with DHL, and I'd been asked, basically the remit was they were looking for someone who had some military experience and had been involved in a startup. So I went out there, had a series of interviews and got offered the job. So I started doing some planning of my own. First thing obviously was, what am I going to wear when I go out to Iraq? And sartorial elegance has never been a strong point of mine, as you can see. But I then started doing a bit more serious planning and thinking about, what is it going to be like? I had a slightly romantic view because I'd read archaeology, as all great people have, Jules, at university, and arrived to a point thinking, look, at the very least, I'm going to be able to trot around and see what's going on from an archaeological perspective, which is possibly slightly naive. And I also started thinking about, what it was going to be like out there. So I spoke to a friend of my parents who had been jailed by Saddam Hussein for 10 years and had been released. And he was very, very interesting and was actually extremely positive about, quite frankly, what was a horrendous experience. And he didn't have a bad thing to say about the Iraqis. And remember, back at this time, we didn't really think it was going to develop into the train wreck that it has developed into. So there was a lot of hope around what might be happening. Anyway, the time came for me to fly out there, and as I was flying out, and probably the emptiest plane in the world because all sane people were flying out of the region, I was thinking about what I'd be doing and thinking about my entry into Iraq, and part of that, to my mind, involved spending a good few weeks in Bahrain, sitting around planning things and being pretty relaxed about life. But I arrived in Bahrain and got met off the plane airside and thought, well, this is very nice. They obviously think I'm a bit more important than I actually am. I got stuck in a car and we drove round to the DHL hub, and my new boss came bounding down the stairs and said, really good news, the war's over, which had happened whilst I was on my flight over, and we've got permission to fly into Baghdad and the plane leaves in an hour. And I was sort of standing there thinking, oh God, what have I let myself in for? So I thought I'd better go and check and see what my supplies were. DHL marketing team had done a brilliant job on the new liveried yellow vans, which are going to be perfect for driving around Baghdad. And I then started having a look at what my other supplies were. So the job experienced student had clearly got my food together. And I needed to think a bit more about communications. You'll see that satellite dish down there was my portable email system because there simply weren't going to be any communications. I had a satellite phone, camp bed chucked in there as well. And I got given $25,000 in cash, as a wad. Here's your startup, off you go. So we got on the plane and sort of took off from Bahrain, heading to Baghdad. And whilst I was on the plane, I started thinking about, I was slightly panicking, thinking, right, I'd better come up with a plan because I'm going to be there in a few hours, and I haven't really thought this one through. And I used something called there's a thing in the army called the estimate process, which helps you plan, very much as I was talking at the beginning. We all do one, actually, whether it's us working out where the hospital club is at 6 o'clock this morning, thinking I've got to get there and what I'm going to say when I do get there. We plan a route and we look at what the pros and cons are. In this scenario, I had a very clear mission, which was to set up DHL. I'd done a little bit of work, understand the environment, and then, this is the military headings, by the way, so I wasn't going in there thinking there's an enemy out there. I was actually thinking, who are my competitors? What are the assets I have? And what are the courses of action that I'm likely to take? And as I was doing this, the plane was suddenly buffeted, and I sort of stopped to look around at where I was. So I was flying in an Antonov, and I don't know if anyone's ever been in one, but they're pretty basic. There was half of it was for cargo, and there was a little room, and I was sitting on this plastic bench in what was a bit like a working man, 1970s sort of working man's club. So the walls were covered in a sort of silver-flecked lino. There were pictures of semi-clad women clutching a variety of automatic weapons, on the walls. And I noticed out of the corner of my eye this rather rotund, what looked like a naked man clutching a sausage, lurching towards me, and realised that it was Boris, the engineer, who was my attendant, and he had heated a Frankfurter in a kettle and had a shot of vodka and a Frankfurter as my in-flight meal. So they had and the reason he didn't have any clothes on is because they didn't like to spend money on washing their uniforms. And it was so hot on the plane, so they basically all flew around in their underpants. I was meanwhile slightly more chaste and was sitting there sweating profusely, clearly thinking about what I was going to do when I got there. So I arrived in Baghdad. We were met by some fairly bemused troops who were wondering what we were doing there. Luckily, I had some Jack Daniels because I needed to find somewhere to stay, and basically found a warehouse on the airport and put the camp bed up there, and then decided to drive into Baghdad to go and have a look. So you'll see the airport's down in the bottom corner, and that route into town at the time was fine. Obviously deteriorated slightly as the year wore on. When we drove into town for the first time, it was utter chaos. There'd been removal of all security forces and police. People were clearly very desperate to make money. They'd done things like raid the zoo. Someone tried to sell me a snake, which wasn't that helpful. We arrived at the Palestine Hotel, and on the way into town, saw a lot of the precision bombing that had been going on. Now, it was precise, but there was an awful lot of it. And so, actually, a lot of the buildings had been destroyed. This is the statue of Saddam that was pulled down. And so very quickly we decided to try and work out, what the market was like. And the slide and the title slightly sort of conflict with each other, me clutching an AK-47, but we're a bit nervous about life out there as things were deteriorating. So I went to the local market and bought some guns, as you do, and trained the guys with me on how to shoot them, and then we drove around literally the length and breadth of the country. And as we drove around, saw a lot of evidence of the ego of Saddam Hussein, and met what was to become our biggest client, which is the US military. Now, the US military had a terrible supply chain, so they could get things from the US into Baghdad within about 4 months, and we could do it in 4 days. So it became a reasonably easy conversation to have. But when I first had that, I couldn't really get them to get past the fact that we weren't FedEx, and they didn't understand the fact that we were very similar. Anyway, we got there eventually and started doing the usual sort of marketing things as you do, give them an umbrella by the tank 'cause it was a bit hot, do barbecues for them. And actually, we built a really amazing bunch of employees. Now, I think one of the things that I derived huge pleasure from was working with a huge mix of people. And I think when I was going through some quite tricky times out there, all you have to do is look around you, and there are often people having a far harder time. And if you can just go and help them or show some empathy with them, it really supports you as an individual when you're trying to look at, what's the optimistic sort of element that's going on around you. We had a variety of employees, some expats, some Belgians who did a lot of the flying for us, and of course the Bulgarian pilots. You wouldn't believe it, their captain was called Igor Smirnov, which was fairly appropriate for most of what they spent their time doing. This guy was Boris, Sergei, who was the navigator, so he sat in the nose of the plane with a GPS, pretending he knew where he was going. And it was a pretty extraordinary bunch. We had a lot of Iraqi employees, some more beautiful than others, but they were a mixture of Sunni, Shia, Catholic, Christian, Muslim, and getting them all working together was phenomenal. Things deteriorated from a security perspective. I don't think that the donkey one worked that well, but the bottom one did work, and actually it was the day of the World Cup final. I was due to go and watch the rugby with the Australians who were down at the airport, and as I was walking over, our plane had just taken off and it got hit by a missile. Cue sort of panic, basically, and a lot of what happened over the next 20 sort of hour actually was trying to tell people in Bahrain, calm the staff down, and hope that these guys managed to land the plane. As it turned out, they did an amazing job. Effectively, they'd lost all control. I don't know how much you know about flying, but all the fuel is stored in the wings, and that's the bit that was hit. And so they basically went round around the airport until the fuel had burnt off. They had lost total control, so they were using their rudders to do essentially move the plane, the engines on and off, so they could move up and down and steer left and right. It's rather like someone taking your steering wheel off you when you're in the fast lane of a motorway. They managed to land it, and you can see some of the damage that the missile had caused, so it was a minor miracle. Things deteriorated pretty rapidly within Iraq. The operating environment became very difficult. And we ended up moving out of hotels in Baghdad and building a porta-cabin village in the airport itself. I think some of the key points that came out of that year for me, really, and I alluded to it right at the beginning, was to make sure that I had a very clear idea of what I was trying to achieve and to constantly review that. Trying to bring a bit of humour into my leadership was something that was easier said than done, but actually sitting down and writing about what had happened that day in the evening was a brilliant way of spending a bit of time reflecting on what actually was going on and drawing the positives out of a fairly extraordinary situation. Learning your market, all these good things. I think one of the key things that came out of it was really the work that I was doing with the staff and the rest of the team there, who were absolutely phenomenal, and I think that really keeps you going. Running out of time, so in conclusion, really, I would say, if you look at the piece that I talked about at the beginning with regards to building the small steps, having that flexibility in your life, or particularly when you've got a particular project that you're doing, really, really helped me, because it helped me adjust when all sorts of weird things were happening left, right and centre, and enabled me to sort of maintain some sanity and some positivity around everything I was doing. Finally, I would say, if you see this guy at the control of your aircraft, you probably do need to have a fairly optimistic view on life. I got on so well with the pilots that when we were leaving Baghdad for my last trip out, I said to them, can I have a go on your plane? Amazingly, they said, yeah, you can do the takeoff. So there I was, going down the airport, going down the runway, thinking, I can't believe they're actually letting me do this. But it's quite easy, actually, as it turned out. And then they let me do a bit of flying as well. I don't think the first pilot was that impressed. But I think I'll end it there. And thanks very much for listening.